I'm Sarah Gleason-Ross, if I haven't met you before, Director of College Counseling. And I'm joined here by my colleagues. I don't see Matthew, but Justin Baker, Anna Follingsby, and Matt's directing traffic, I think. Here he comes. Also, our friend Cesar Chiante on the video. Thank you. We are so pleased to work with Phil Pine of Capital Educators. I always tell him, I've heard his presentation a number of times, probably 7 times, and I enjoy listening to him talk every single time. He's so informed about what he does, and who would have ever thought that the situation, the landscape would have changed so much in the past couple of years. So we're really glad to have his expertise. Phil is the president and co-founder of Capital Educators. As an undergraduate at Princeton, he tutored students in preparation for the SAT, so that goes way back, I guess. He taught American and World History at Princeton High School and the Dalton School, and before pursuing his MBA at the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania. Over the years, Phil has taken the actual SAT many times, something you will never find me doing, spent thousands of hours researching and writing educational curricula, and published a prominent SAT book. Phil personally trains every Cap Ed instructor. He has helped hundreds of families, maybe more, navigate the college application process and regularly picks up the phone at his headquarters, just like all the other directors. He also has served hundreds of underserved students receive inexpensive test prep by providing financial aid and running pro bono programs. He sits on the advisory boards of the National Cathedral Scholars Program and Bridges at St. Paul's School. So welcome, Phil. Thank you for being with us this morning. I'll turn it over to you.
I love coming, but I'm always really uncomfortable when the bio gets read, so I'm glad that's behind me. Again, I'm Phil Pine. I run Capital Educators. I've been doing so since the late 90s, which makes me aging and hopefully a little bit wiser than when I started. Testing is in a state of flux and change, which makes things interesting, if you'll appreciate that word. But I thought I'd start with something a little more old school and show you all a sample math question from the test. This may bring back some unpleasant memories, but I think it's illustrative. This is a math problem I stole from the very back of an SAT, like one of the last questions on the test, significance being that they typically place the hardest content at the end. So this is a problem that 90% of the country answered incorrectly when it was first administered quite some time ago. I'm already getting glazed looks on your eyes. This worries me. So I won't take too long, but this guy, Vicken, drives to work at an average speed of 40 kilometers per hour and returns along the same route at 60 kilometers per hour. And they want to know what's his average speed in kilometers per hour for the round trip. Okay. Let me just ask you this, no pressure, okay? Where do you think most 16 and 17-year-old eyes are going to gravitate really quickly and maybe incorrectly? C. I mean, you really can't find a more tempting choice than that. So one of the first things we coach the guys to do is, at the bare minimum, don't pick C, okay? And we have a name for choices like C in this field. We call them Joe Bloggs choices because the average Joe always goes there. And it's okay if you find the first couple questions to be super easy. But if you do one of the last questions on the test that quickly, without a pencil or a calculator or a little bit of thought, you're wrong. Even if you don't know why, you're not right. See if anybody here really understands the Joe Bloggs mindset. If you don't pick 50, but you still have the Joe Bloggs bug, where do you think is the next place you go? Nice. Confident and correct, okay? D, which is basically a lazy way of saying, you know what, I can't do it. It's too hard. Cannot be done. If you want to convey one detail to your students over the kitchen table, you can tell them it can't be determined is never going to be right near the end of these tests, because if they bother to write the question, it will have a numerical answer always. So for someone like me who prepares students for these exams, this is a very good place to be. Yeah, it's 50-50, but it really isn't. because even if it's been 30 plus years since you've taken a math class, which choice makes no sense? Can't be A. We get B. We pick up 15 SAT points, which is big. And maybe more important than the sheer number, we pick up 15 points we're not supposed to get, which are doubly valuable in the scheme of things. I won't bore you with too much of the math, and I promise this is the only math we will do. But just super quickly, this guy drives to work at what speed? 40. That's the same enthusiasm I get in the classes, by the way. Thank you for that. Okay? And he goes back at? Okay, 60. So at what speed is this person spending more time in the car? 40. And that's really all you need to know to get this problem right. Since he's spending more time at the slow speed, what's that going to do to his average? It's going to drop it. It's not going to take it far from the 50 that we all still collectively wish were the right answer, okay? Just enough of a change to cause problems for kids when they're taking the test. So, couple of points to make here. The first is tricky, right? The good news is these tests are actually less tricky than they were back in the day when we all took them in high school. These kinds of questions still exist, but there are fewer of them. The truth is, what the tests are going after now aligns a bit more with what students learn in school, okay? So that's something to keep in mind. Second thing, do you guys see any pre-calculus or calculus happening here? No, all right? The SAT and ACT are not going to test the most sophisticated material, the most high-charge students are going to see later in high school, because they don't want the exams to be a test of your school versus another school. They want it to be on essentially common knowledge. So as long as your son has seen some Algebra 2, okay, he's probably had enough high school math to start thinking about sitting for the official test. So, trickiness, okay, not that sophisticated. Third point is, where did I say I took this problem? Which test, do you remember? SAT. Even though this was an SAT problem, it's actually more likely to be on the ACT nowadays, which reinforces an important fact, which is, even though these tests are different, and we will talk about the differences today, that's on the agenda, they still have more in common than they don't. And that can be a real benefit to students in navigating their own testing plans. Essentially, that they have two exams that test fairly similar stuff. All right? Okay, goodbye. And by the way, the Vicken question will never show up again. So even if you do share this with your son, okay? Joe Bloggs will, not Vicken. All right, so again, the big question, students are typically figuring out sometime between the spring of 10th grade and the middle of 11th is, which of these tests am I supposed to take? Which one maybe will put me in the best possible light? And today the real main choices are the paper ACT versus the digital SAT. And the reason we have this conversation is that colleges nowadays are 100% equally happy to get either one of these scores from your son when he ultimately applies. As a matter of fact, you all know we're living in a test-optional universe right now, yes? So given test-optional admissions policies, there are fewer scores in circulation, which makes this doubly true. I mean, they'll be happy to get any number that you're willing to share with them. So as your sons navigate which test might be better for them, one factor that should not play a role at all is what they think the college wants to see. They're happy either way. And I think before answering this question, we should pull back and talk about the test optional landscape, because I know this is a big topic that's on several people's minds. As you're probably aware, for the last bunch of years, the boys have technically been able to apply almost anywhere they've wanted with or without a standardized test score, okay? There were plenty of schools that were test optional in 2018 and 2019, but with the arrival of COVID, the landscape changed quite a bit, to the point where the only schools that were requiring these numbers of every applicant tended to be service academies, larger southern state school systems, couple of private institutions. That said, if you've been following the news at all, I got a couple of nods already, over the last 6 weeks, there's been a little bit of movement, keeping things interesting for all of us in the field of counseling and testing. Since the late February, early March, Dartmouth, Yale, Brown, and the UT Austin have all changed their testing policies, returning to a place where they are requiring testing of their applicants. It's dangerous to make bold predictions. We were starting to before the presentation even began, but I think what's safe to say is that over the next 18 months, which is kind of a relevant span for you all, over the next couple of admission cycles, I think you can expect this list to grow. I don't think necessarily that it's going to explode, okay? Meaning, by the time your sons are applying, they're going to be looking at, okay, a chunk of schools that flat out require tests, a chunk of schools that may prefer testing, and a great number that remain test optional. And even with this slight change, this maybe minor turning point in the last month or two, my advice is really no different this spring than it was last spring. Here's what we really want from the guys. We want them to think about these tests, to plan for them, ideally to prep for them, okay, and definitely to take them, okay? Because if they do all that and they collect their scores, when senior fall comes rolling around and they're sitting down with their college counselors, they'll be able to figure out college by college, application by application, what to do with the scores, okay? Some of your boys will send their scores everywhere. How come? Yeah, one word, that's it, high. Because if they think they did well enough that the scores are going to strengthen or support their application, they're going to draw attention, okay? Great. It's conceivable your son may end up sending his scores nowhere. If the transcript is here and the scores are there and there's too wide a discrepancy and the colleges don't require testing, okay? Maybe we keep them in our pocket and we never share them. You're allowed to do that. What's highly likely is that your son is going to be somewhere in the middle, where they end up sending their scores to some places where we think they'll be useful and shielding them from other places where we don't. I don't want to put you on the spot, Sarah, but to what degree are guys falling into that last category, that here and there approach? With a few more to many more schools requiring testing over the next year or two, I think it's even a greater lock that your sons will be sending them to some but not to others. Bottom line is, though, the only way to have this choice is to take the test. And so one reason I don't think test optional admissions is going away is that there really are some benefits that different parties experience pretty much immediately. When colleges stop requiring scores, what happens to the number of applications they receive? How come? Why do you think the numbers go up so much? Yeah, there are no guardrails. There's a lot less fear, right? More kids feel more emboldened to submit to more places. So that happens. The second thing that happens that has gradually gotten more attention is that these colleges all of a sudden find that their average incoming SAT and ACT scores look really good because there's total self-selection at play, right? The only students who are sharing their results in an optional world are the ones who are really happy with how they did. And this has skewed averages across the board. It's made them all much higher than they used to be, and frankly, much more intimidating than they were, which we'll talk about. So colleges are seeing more apps, lower admit rate, higher scores, maybe a higher ranking in U.S. news. And they derive these benefits all while efforting something that's truly enviable, which is improving access, equity, and inclusion, right? Okay, that was a major, major part of the original motivation here. If you don't care that much on the institutional side, the current system helps the boys in two ways. It will broaden their list. They will most likely have a couple of schools on their list that might not have been there 7 years ago because numerically those schools might have been prohibitive. But the bigger piece is the control piece. The fact that you all as a family and your sons as applicants can decide what to do with their scores. It's taken me a gazillion years of doing this, but I've tried to actually stop calling it test optional admissions now. I call it send optional. It's pretty deep. Okay? Because honestly, I mean, with very rare exceptions, your guys are going to take the tests. And the real issue is where are they going to end up sharing those scores. Arguments against test optional admissions that are, to be candid, behind some of the recent decisions that we've seen out of places like Dartmouth and Yale and Brown and UT. One of them is, listed here at the top, that without scores, colleges are making less informed decisions. I won't get into too many of the details here, but what's been revealed and what was always part of the equation is that scores plus transcript is supposed to be highly predictive of success in college, at least during freshman year, if not beyond that. All right. The second point is a little more subtle. What some schools have discovered is that even though they entered into test optional admissions with the goal of improving equity and access, they may not have actually accomplished that. Okay? As families, I think the one frustrating aspect of the current system you can all appreciate, it's that last bullet there, and that is that there's an inherent lack of transparency right now. Basically, when I meet any group, I am asked in one way or another, how optional is optional? What does that really mean? And if I don't send a score, are they going to assume that I tanked it? And is that going to put me at a disadvantage? And generally speaking, the way I look at it is, if you apply without a score, it's not going to provide an active disadvantage, but you may be foregoing a potential benefit, right? And so, again, I think the messaging is pretty simple for now. We want them to take the test, and we'll continue to monitor this and figure it out as we get deeper. Any questions on that? I know it's a pretty loaded, dense subject. All right, I totally don't believe you, but that's fine. Guys, as you have questions, just ask. We're not that large a group. I'm happy to entertain them. I have one more exercise related to test optional admissions, and then we'll dive into the tests in a little more detail. This is a slide I know I've shared here before. I want to take a look at how a few students might make the decision about what to do with their scores. Maryland applicants, okay? 12th graders. And first thing you'll notice, check out the average incoming SAT score at College Park. Right? Not what we saw in 1989, just saying. Okay? Now, there are a few things at play, just to clarify. One of them I already made one point. Who is scoring 1420? The students on campus who shared their scores, right? The highest scoring students on campus had that 1420. The second thing I will let you know about is even though the SAT is still scored out of 1,600 points, just like it was back in the day, all right, the scores have been tweaked and inflated several times over, okay? So just to give you a data point, I'll go back to 1989, just cause. An SAT score of 1,200 in 1989 is equivalent to about a 1,350 now. So if you have like an unhealthy competition thing with your kid, you can just kind of quietly add 150 points to your score. So there are reasons why the numbers look as rough as they are. But let's take a look at the decision-making processes of a few kids. So here's our first student. He's sitting with a 1470. Maybe he earned that score in one sitting. Maybe it took him 2 or 3 sittings to mix and match his numbers in a super score to get that. But what's he going to do with that 1470 at Maryland? He's almost definitely going to send it. And that score may be high enough not only to enhance the likelihood he's admitted, but maybe to help with a scholars program or honors. So that's easy. Okay. Here's our second applicant. Similar looking guy, 1290, okay? Now, let's not get, let's not get dismissive here. A 1290 is a really good score. It's way, way, way beyond the national average. It's a number that may be very helpful at several schools on this student's list. But if he's a serious applicant for College Park, what's he going to do? He's going to shield them, okay? It's this next student that I think is the most interesting and worth the most conversation. So here's somebody who's coming in with a 1380, all right? So he's about 40 points below the midline. What's your instinct on this? A few, no, yes, so yeah, it's mixed. And by the way, I want to make a point. No matter what we decide on this oversimplified screen here, when it comes time senior year to make these decisions, you don't pull the trigger without speaking with college counseling, because not only do they know sort of the national numbers, they have the hyper-local, okay, history here at Gilman over the last several years, which we didn't have in 2020, 2021 when we were doing this. My inclination here is that 8 or 9 times out of 10, this student will submit the scores. Okay? And I think this is the kind of student that many of the colleges are frustrated they're not getting numbers from. Students who are really like approaching the so-called average, whose scores are high enough that they show you can do the work on the campus, with numbers that are corroborative, who are just anxious about sharing that number because they look at the average. So to me, the starting point is, if you're north of the 25th percentile nationally, if you're coming in around here or above, you want to seriously consider sharing those scores. I have a student in this exact same boat right now. She's taken the test twice. She's improved a couple hundred points. She's up to 1390. Her dream school has an average of 1410. And so I am doing somersaults to try to explain that she's there and that those last 2 questions are not going to change her admissions likelihood. But it's hard for people to see and to believe. All right. Did I oversimplify things too much here, or am I on target? We're okay? Sure. So, a couple things. You've probably noticed I've been saying things like 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10, probably, because every student's situation is different. Where they go to school, the rigor of their classes, their transcript, all that factors into whether the scores are worth sharing. Generically speaking, though, I would say if your scores fall almost 150 points below the midline, it's probably going to be your advantage to shield them. If they're closer, though, if you're 50 points below or less, it may very well be the opposite advice. If you're curious about this, see how your students are scoring on practice exams like the PSAT. You can look at college averages within seconds online and just get an initial feeling, because it'll help you determine to what degree the scores may be of benefit. I'll also say this: no matter how well or poorly you think your son did on the 10th grade PSAT, I can promise he'll do way better by the time he's done. Way better. Why do you think I say that? Hopefully they're going to study. Maybe some of them will take the class we run on campus, which you can talk about later. What else? And there's a lot more learning and brain development and reading. Even if they don't formally prep, we see significant gains. So don't feel like whatever those 10th grade numbers are you're stuck with or married to. They will change almost independent of how much work your student specifically puts in. They're maturing quite a bit. 18 months to them between the middle of sophomore year and the beginning of 12th grade, right? They are different people. You know, for us, it's a slow decline. Yeah. Yep.
Do you advise them to take it again?
Yeah, I mean,
Just right before, like kind of after they've taken all their course loads and...
yeah, it really depends. So here's the thing. The students I deal with are the ones who are working with me for months. And we typically have 4 or 5 practice test results for them on file from simulated exams. if your son goes in and just blows those numbers out of the water, we will often say, yeah, in my opinion, you're done. A lot of times students will keep going because it's kind of in the zeitgeist to test more than once. But I think everyone's testing path is different depending on where they score and where they score compared with what we expect. So I'll avoid that. Yeah. So, yeah, given this whole maturation thing and the fact that the guys are developing, there are trade-offs. So one thing I'll say is on the verbal side, yeah, if they're a year older, they're going to be more adept at handling the verbal portion of the test because they're going to be better readers and better critical thinkers. However, if they're on an advanced math track and you wait that year, they're a year removed, 1+ year removed from the easier, more elementary SAT and ACT math. So I think in the end, what we really recommend is that they test at a time that works for them and that they prep when they have the energy to do it. Over the last bunch of years, we've had more and more of the guys starting this process the summer before junior year, not because we're in a huge rush necessarily, but because we think they have the bandwidth to take a class and do the work then. So I think in the end it comes down to their schedule and level of motivation more than the 6-month timing. The scores last five years, so you're good. So, and what you're describing is very common. It's incredibly likely that when your student takes the test for the first time, particularly if he does so pretty early, like next fall, that only one of the scores will be where he wants it to be. And that's fine. That's still an accomplishment because he can go back in a second time and work on that other portion.
And the schools don't see, I mean, you can shield that you've taken it 7 times and you can cherry pick.
Yeah, at most you're going to show a college that you've taken it twice because one test might have the math score you want and one test might have the verbal score. They're not going to know that you've made a habit out of it. And by the way, I'm not recommending anybody test 7 times, okay? I've tested dozens of times in my life because I have no outside hobbies or interests, okay? Your sons are probably have more going for them. Usually it's 2 or 3 times total, which we'll totally get to. Really good questions. Let me try to revisit this same multiple choice question by talking about the tests a little bit, and specifically by starting on this whole digital exam, which they all took in the fall, right? The PSAT. Yes? Okay, it was a little delayed reaction. Okay. So, a couple things. As you probably know, the guys are not able to take the test any day they'd like at home at their convenience. I think that day is coming, but not for a little while. They have to report to a testing center. They have to bring their number 2 pencil and a calculator. But the main thing they'll need is a laptop or tablet, and it'll have the College Board's Blue Book application downloaded on it, which they already have done this past fall before the PSAT. Other than just the novelty of taking the test on screen, the biggest difference with this new test is its brevity. It's more than an hour shorter than its predecessor, and it's about an hour shorter than its competitor, the paper ACT. Do you know how they were able to shorten the exam? I'm sorry? Shorter questions. Yeah, there's a little more to it too, structurally. You've heard this? So the new test is adaptive, okay? Meaning, how you do at the very beginning of the test impacts the kinds of questions that you see later in the test. And that design change is what shortened it so much and made the test a little more attractive, I think, for most students. So here's how it works. Whether it's a PSAT, which doesn't technically count, or the SAT, which does, okay, your exam starts with a verbal module, okay, a section of verbal questions, primarily of intermediate or moderate difficulty. Medium questions, okay? If a student handles that first module well, he'll be routed to a second module of greater difficulty, where there's a higher percentage of tougher questions. If that first section didn't go quite as well, he'll be routed to an easier second module. So there's one moment at which the test adapts, and that is after you complete the first module. The path you're on is not really meant to be a reward or a punishment. It's meant to deal with the efficiency. If you're not a naturally strong tester, okay, by landing in this module, no longer are you going to be tortured with like 24 super hard questions you're unlikely to get correct anyway. And the opposite is true here. If you're more naturally adept at testing, if you land in the harder second module, you're not going to be wasting your time on problems you might be able to handle pretty darn easily. So that's the idea behind it. And this same procedure repeats on the math side. You start with intermediate questions, and you're either routed to more difficult or slightly easier ones. If you're able to make out the numbers on the screen, you'll see that you can earn pretty solid scores out of either path. You can get a 600 in math or verbal operating out of the easier module. But if your son is a stronger tester, if he's looking for something more like 700 or higher, what does he need to do? Yeah, you need to start off strong. You need to make sure you get into that harder second module. Any questions on this? Okay. A couple other elements on this digital test. Okay. Does this look vaguely familiar? Okay. This is what reading comprehension has looked like for decades, including when we were all in school. Long passages with 8 or 10 or 12 associated questions. The ACT continues to have plenty of this, okay? 40 questions of it, as a matter of fact. But the digital SAT no longer has long reading passages at all. Instead, they're short. They're somewhere between 25 and 150 words each, and each individual paragraph, essentially, has its own question associated with it. College Board, the people who do the SAT, they're not dumb. They write a test that's on computer. That's sort of interesting. It's an hour shorter. And then they do this. What do you think they're trying to pull off? They're trying to get more people to take their test. And in the short term, I can tell you, as someone who's been working on this for 2 years, it's working, okay? When in doubt, more students are now looking to take the SAT because it's perceived to be a little friendlier. But I do want to make one point. Even though certainly this looks more attractive than that, okay, shorter passages do have their drawbacks. Given something this short, you have to understand exactly what every word means. You have to know what every turn of phrase means. And maybe more importantly, because there's only one question with each paragraph, you have to go in and out of 27 different topics to get through a single verbal module. Does that make sense? So I think it actually causes some brain drain that some people may overlook. So don't get me wrong, I still think this looks better than the other, but it does have its cost. I won't bore you here, but the math has its own built-in calculator, a Desmos calculator that they can use to graph. But a lot of the guys will still bring their own device if they're more comfortable using it. That's perfectly fine. And finally, the digital test allows you to kind of track your progress with a scorecard. So it's not like you do a question and you never see it again. If you want to go back and review it, you can. You can see how I did. I answered 4 questions. And when I got to the 4th, though, I was a little underconfident, so I flagged it for review. And so when I finish the section, I will revisit this page and remember to go back and rethink number 4. Another place this benefits us as coaches, as instructors, is that in many cases, it's smart for the guys not to do the questions in order. Because, for example, I can tell you, the densest, most difficult part of the exam typically falls between 5 and 15. So what a number of students will do is knock out the easier questions, skip ahead, and then return to the hardest material at the end and get as many of them right as possible. So there is some good strategy involved when you really get to know the test. All right. This is the digital SAT, okay? Shorter passages, shorter amount of time, calculator, and the scorecard. All right. So, how do you decide between the two exams? This one slide I did include in the handout you have so that if you really are into the minutia on your own, you can do this. You can kind of go subject by subject and look at it. But I thought what I would do for now is just sort of focus on the biggest differences between the tests. I was happier with this graphic than you guys seem to be, but I thought that was cool. All right. So I'm starting over here. Big picture. How are these exams different? Okay. For starters, on content, the ACT has a science section. It's the last section of the test. It's 40 questions long. It's 35 minutes. It's pretty dense. It's a lot of like dense language, graphs and tables and charts. It's the section the guys have the most difficulty with every time before they start to prep because it's in the least familiar format, okay? The SAT tests science, but the questions are so interspersed that they barely notice. They're just kind of sprinkled throughout the exam. The second big difference is in math. The ACT tests much more geometry and many more miscellaneous topics like matrices or logarithms and things like that. And so the upshot is the ACT feels like it tests more stuff more superficially. On the other hand, SAT has limited geometry and instead doubles down on algebra. So there's much more Algebra 1 and Algebra 2 on it. Fewer topics, greater depth. But to be candid, almost nobody picks their poison here, okay, based on a love of geometry or a hatred of science or the opposite. It's way more subjective than that for the guys typically, okay? For starters, the platform might be the game changer here. There may be some of your guys who are like, I really prefer this new computer thing, and others who say, you know what? I'm used to working paper and pencil. That is more comfortable for me. Fine. The other thing to keep in mind is there are big pacing differences. To be clear about it, the ACT, honestly, is a little bit easier in some ways. There are more easy questions on it. Every section starts with a whole bunch of easy questions that gradually get more difficult. Okay? Some students really like that. They kind of warm up, and by the time they hit the harder ones, they're in a pretty good, confident place. But despite the fact that they're more easy questions, you have to go way faster. More than 50% faster. Check this out. The ACT is 215 questions asked in just about 3 hours. The SAT, on the current digital platform, is 98 questions in 2.25 hours. So I shared that at a school a couple weeks ago, and a dad raised his hand very earnestly and was like, Phil, I hate to ask the Joe Bloggs question, but why would anybody take the ACT? And the answer is like, if it's going to generate a better score for your son, we suck it up and we answer a few extra questions, most of which are easy anyway, okay? But as you guys can appreciate, when students score about the same in practice, they are tending to gravitate here, right? Because it just is more accessible. And it is much less timed. Very few people have trouble finishing SATs, to the point where if your son is someone who qualifies for accommodations, extended time, odds are he'll end up having way more time than he'd like to finish the test. So that's a difference right now. Yeah. So the question is, do some people take both tests? Many do. A good chunk of the students I see will. Because here's my attitude about it. To ballpark, the tests are probably 30% different and 70% identical. If they're going to work with us for like 2 or 3 months at this and become much stronger testers, in my mind, in many cases, like, why not be willing to take the other test? We can always shield it. There's not a single college that is expecting both SATs and ACTs. So there isn't an awful lot to lose. So I think that's really a good question and sort of a wise thing. Even if your son is pretty darn sure he knows which test is the better fit, you should always keep that other test in your back pocket as a possibility, because it may end up proving to be valuable. And every once in a while, I shouldn't even say that, there's a good percentage of students who will surprise themselves and end up doing better on the test they thought they were less suited to. It started internationally a year and a half ago. It started on the PSAT this fall, and this March, just a month and a half ago, they administered the first one nationally here in the States. Yeah, I mean, don't quote me, but I'd be shocked if anything changes by the time they go through. They use something called item response theory to put the test together. Basically, they know exactly how difficult every question on that test is before they publish it, because they've administered it in experimental cases for years. So in that sense, they're able to hone in on a score much more efficiently and quickly. I've had the ability to look at a good amount of data on the new test versus the old, and the scores line up pretty much perfectly. That doesn't mean some students don't surprise you here and there, but the averages are where you'd expect them to be. They don't share their algorithm, but I can tell you what we do when we write our own tests that simulate it. We are assessing the percentage of students who are answering each question correctly, and then we're doing that based on the other practice scores we have for them. So we're essentially able to figure out which are the most difficult and the easiest and the in-between questions. And we categorize them into 6 or 7 different categories of difficulty. It can be a number of different things. It can be how easily understood is the question itself, the verbiage of it. Some of these questions are deliberately worded in tricky ways. You saw the question I started with. Sometimes, getting back to that other question too, it's the answer choices and how many distractor choices they put in there. Sometimes there's one obvious answer and the other 3 are just terrible. Sometimes it's the exact same question, but 2 of those other choices are incredibly tempting, and they know they're going to pull 3/4 of the country to pick them. So this is a very nuanced process. So hopefully that answers a little better. So yeah, I don't know if you could hear it, but the question was, I heard the first math test was really hard. It actually was. They were to ballpark it, if we normally expect 3 or 4 super difficult questions in a hard module, there were 6 or 7 in this test. But as long as the algorithm holds up, as long as the test is curved correctly, it doesn't end up impacting the scores at all, in theory. What the students will learn if they prep for these things well is they're going to learn not to celebrate if they find a section to be super easy, because if it's easy for them, it's probably easy for everybody else. And they also can't lose their confidence in themselves when they run into a wall like that, because odds are, if it's tough for them, it's also going to be universally tough. The thing that's frustrating to people like me is College Board released 6 practice exams, and the one test in March in math was a touch harder than we were expecting. So that was a little bit of disappointment. Now, the test has also been given 3 other times since then, and we have not gotten that feedback. So I think there's going to be some variation. Yeah. So the essence of the question is, the test has changed. How do colleges make sense of it? And by the way, this is not a unique phenomenon. I've been doing this long enough. I've tutored 5 versions of the SAT. Every time you get comfortable with one, it's changed. And every year of transition generates exactly that question. This time, more than any other in the past, the College Board has done an excellent job of equating the scores. Meaning, a 1210 on the paper test is pretty darn close to a 1210 digitally. The reality is, they need to do that in order to give colleges some confidence that they're using the numbers well. Now, that said, is it possible in this first year that colleges are going to be a little more forgiving of a score that's a touch lower on this new format test? I think some will, and I think some have in the past. But I think generally speaking, having that confidence that the new test scores align with the old makes things easier for schools. The College Board that writes the SAT is doing everything it can to keep the test relevant. That, in the end, they're trying to get more bodies than ACT testers, and they're trying to keep the test alive. And so by making it shorter, right, by putting it on computer, by making it a little more accessible, they're hoping there are more tests in circulation, and that, yes, that will directly or indirectly result in more colleges wanting scores down the road. And we don't know to what degree, test required is going to flip back. We're all watching that. Arguably, things have moved up and happened a touch earlier than used to be the case, but you all still have a good number of choices here. As I was mentioning earlier, the earliest I would consider doing any kind of test prep, okay, whether it's with me or with a tutor or on your own, would be this coming summer. And if somebody does work at it this summer, okay, and sees some internal improvement over the time that they're working, then I think testing for the first time in the fall of 11th grade can make perfect sense. We're seeing 2 or 3 test dates that are most popular in the fall. There's a late August SAT, which takes place before school is really happening in earnest, which is kind of nice, or that October exam you mentioned, or even November. So there are chances to test here. And again, I think if somebody does do summer prep, you kind of have to reward them with a real test at the end of it so that they feel like the work they've done pays off. Even if you take this early route, though, there's a great likelihood that the student is not going to be done, that he's going to want to test 1 or 2 more times to capitalize on super scoring and to just test in when he's feeling even more comfortable about it. And so there are a lot of choices. The next band of dates falls in the second semester of 11th grade. If you don't do summer prep, this is probably when you want to start testing for real at the latest. And we see the most interest in either a March SAT and or an April ACT. I think the real goal, no matter how you organize it, is by the end of 11th grade, essentially a year from now, next May, June, you want to have at least one set of scores in your pocket that you are reasonably happy with. Now, if they can be your dream scores, that's even better. We'll take that. But you want them to at least be representative, because when you start to look at colleges in earnest next spring and summer, in the back of your mind, you're going to want to figure out, okay, are the scores I have useful? Am I going to send them to colleges, or am I going to shield them? Or do I need 50 more points? Or am I so far from where I need to be that I'm not going to deal with testing again whatsoever? So I would say by the end of this year, you have 1 or 2 sets of scores, and hopefully feel pretty good about it. At the latest, what's most common for students for whom testing is important is that they test 1 more time at the beginning of 12th grade. And usually it's this combo, either an August SAT or a September ACT. But there are a lot of ways to do this. What I've seen more of lately is I have a lot of juniors prepping and testing and then putting the stuff away for months, sometimes even the entire year. And then they put their college list together, and some of them will do a round of refresher work before senior year and test again at the beginning of the year. I have others who do their prep during the school year and test in the late fall or the early spring, either way. So I think the biggest thing that has changed is there is a higher percentage of students who will test in the beginning of 11th grade. But if you don't, it doesn't put you behind the 8 ball. And as much as I'd love to see many of your guys prepping with us in the summer, if they're really, truly not ready and they're fighting you on this, okay, you may need to just concede and put this off, because the reality is we need them to peak somewhere between here and there. okay? So if you think it's going to be an uphill battle to start this in June of sophomore, junior year, then I would wait. How'd I do there? Short question, but a lengthy answer. Okay, so that gives you some idea? All right. Let me show you the summer course calendar here without being horribly self-promotional, but I just want to give you a sense of what full-fledged test prep might involve time-wise, no matter how you do it. I think we've already circulated these calendars anyway, but I may have brought, 150 of them also, so I can show them to you later. But what I tend to do is we tend to work with the guys once a week for an extended period of time, 3.5 hours. This is purposeful. What I'm trying to do is minimize the amount of outside homework they have to do, primarily because, well, I may not trust them. Let's just leave it at that. I also think that in the scheme of things, test prep homework is often the last thing people focus on. So we take 3.5 hours, we do the teaching, we do the practicing in a structured, supervised setting, and they split their time between math and verbal review. When I form these classes, I don't make a big deal of it, but I do group them according to their scores and their strengths so that we make sure we're working on the right content at the right pace. We also give several full-length practice tests. For some of your guys, this is maybe even more important than content review. Just getting used to the platform, knowing exactly where the hard questions start, the easy questions are done, knowing which questions they need to do in what order. Bottom line is, between the classes and the tests and then optional extra help and makeup time, we probably spend, 2 to 4 dozen hours on this to get people peaking, to get them ready to sit for the test. So no matter how you end up doing this, it's important that you give the guys a runway, a couple of months to really work at this so that they have enough time to get comfortable. There are 3 elements to good prep, no matter how you do it. One of them is learning and relearning content, maybe relearning some of that math material from a year or 2 ago. Learning new test-taking techniques, new strategies, particularly for the hardest questions, and then the comfort level that comes with the practice. And you can get those 3 elements in a number of different ways, but you want to make sure that someone is doing all 3 things no matter how they study for the tests. And there are tons of ways to do this work on your own, should you like, including old school official test books, which you can find in seconds online, as well as thousands of sample questions online through Khan Academy, the College Board, and ACT. They are transparent about what's on the exam nowadays. All right, let me take some questions now. Yeah, please.
But the practice diagnostic SAT tests, are they online?
Yeah, they're digital. We do it just like the real thing. So they bring their laptops and we put them through that process. And that's what's made the last couple of years of my life so tough, is putting those exams together, writing our own tests. Did you guys catch that? So can colleges see your scores if you haven't reported them?
In this situation, they did.
Yeah. In this case, they apparently did. I've never heard of that. One thing to be careful about, when you sign up to take an ACT or an SAT, at the end of that online registration process, a window will pop up that offers you the chance to send your scores for free to 4 colleges. And some people may sort of have an affinity for the free part of this, but we don't want you to do this because we want to have complete control over the scores. That's really strange. I'm glad it worked out for her. And
Yeah, she didn't because she tested.
I think on the institutional side, there were some palpable benefits to going test optional, and we've talked about them, including the points you just make. The downside, though, is it makes the job of admissions officers considerably more challenging. Sarah and I were talking about this earlier. If you're applying to Columbia, you know that 4% of applicants are getting accepted in a given year now because the school is so flooded with applications, right? So the short of it is, what some students, colleges are coming to grips with is they literally don't need the volume of applications they're receiving. And these top places can accept 8 or 9% instead of 4 or 5% and do just as well, if not better. So my sense is that things are flipping back gradually. I would also say, though, students have benefited from test optional admissions because it does give them more agency over what they do with their scores, and that is certainly different. So it's a mixed bag. It really is. I usually am up here to do extra help sessions and makeups periodically, but mostly I'm here to observe and to manage the other instructors. But we're a local group. We only run things from Baltimore down to DC, so I know all the people, and a lot of time goes into matching up the right instructors with the right students. Because what we do is the teachers are aligned with students at different scoring levels for different reasons. In other words, some people on my staff are much better teaching the highest scorers in math, but maybe don't have as much patience as I'd like to work with the lowest scorers, and the reverse. So we're pretty thoughtful about it. That's my cue.
Other questions? I don't see anyone else? No. Thank you, Phil.
My pleasure.
I'm always so impressed.
Thank you.